I too also want to say to the Taoiseach that it is disrespectful, but it doesn't surprise me that neither minister are here to listen to the critique of opposition parties and independents to your budget. You take the same approach with this House and parliamentary debate as you do stuffing state boards with your own personnel to try and get them elected to the Shannon. But you should restore some credibility in terms of parliamentary democracy and hear what we said today. On Saturday, 100,000 people marched through the streets of Dublin. This was the largest demonstration against austerity since the crisis began. It was a march against unjust water taxes, a tax that was dreamt up by Fianna Fáil and eagerly implemented by Fine Gael and Labour. It was an expression of the anger that people feel against your government, Taoiseach, that has no sense of fairness. After 6 long years of spending cuts and tax hikes, of unemployment and immigration, of bank bailouts and of golden handshakes, people are saying enough is enough. While today's budget will be spun by the government as a technical end of austerity, it won't end austerity for many, many ordinary people. Because austerity just isn't simply about balancing the books. It means placing the burden on the fiscal adjustments on those least able to pay. It is a policy, Taoiseach, and you're not aware of austerity because you didn't have to feel it yourself, but it's a policy that makes ordinary, hard-working people pay for the bad decisions and reckless behaviour of the few. It is deeply unfair, and it doesn't work. After almost 4 years in government, Fine Gael and Labour can no longer blame Fianna Fáil for the state of our economy or our society. And let me just remind you, Taoiseach, today there are 28,000 less young people in employment than when you took office. In the first 6 months, could you please have some respect?
Yeah,
please, you haven't stopped speaking, and I've been speaking for 3 minutes.
Sorry.
You've been nibbling away over there. Have some respect and some decency.
We'll have order for the Speaker.
Taoiseach, you mightn't like to hear this, but there has been 28,000 less young people employed in this state since your government took office. 5,500 net new jobs have been created at the start of this month, but it would take a long, long time to deal with the 374,800 people that are stuck on the dole. And Taoiseach, with respect,
please.
Can I ask you maybe if you want to speak, can you answer a question? Is it any wonder that over 200 people, mainly young people, continue to emigrate every single day in search of work or a better future? Because Sean Jempok is a Taoiseach, tan na figuri mar haru that the hutch reina. Sean Iraq, the policy Fine Gael agus party na Kipre. Agus Sean and Kushkro, Ted Mila Danya, Moorfield, Fries Regin the Bonicia, agus Nikita Milcha Ella e Portapiarto, Naro able to be in. But Taoiseach, today, your government had an opportunity to say and to show that you have listened to the people. You could have introduced a budget that would have eased the burden on the vast majority of people, a budget that would stimulate domestic economy and start a renewal of our public services. Unfortunately, Minister and Taoiseach, what you have introduced is a budget driven by the same policies of your previous budgets. You are taking the same failed approach to the recovery as you did to the recession, because you are wedded to the politics of privilege. The anger on the streets of central Dublin on Saturday was matched by the results in Dublin South West and Roscommon South Leitrim by-elections. A clear majority of voters in both constituencies said no to Fianna Fáil, no to Fine Gael and no to Labour's austerity policies. Clearly, you have lost your mandate. You no longer have the support of the people. In the dying days, Taoiseach, of the last Fianna Fáil administration, Micheál Martin's party had clearly lost touch with the people. They had clearly lost touch with the public mood. They were no longer able to hear what the people were saying. But your government is worse, because you have heard the voice of the people, and yet you carry on regardless. So let me spell it out to you, Taoiseach, what the people are saying. You need to scrap water charges, and you need to scrap them now. Because this is a government that's not just out of touch, but is arrogantly ignoring the appeal of the vast majority of people for an ending of the burden of austerity on their families and their communities. And it may seem strange to government TDs that anger has spilled onto the streets and into the ballot boxes. How can it be, asked the puzzled backbenchers that turn up here, The Troika are gone, the economy is growing, people are back to work, the deficit is under control, the recovery has finally arrived. Are people that really ungrateful? The backbencher asks, can they not see that things are getting better? But what the backbencher doesn't understand is, unfortunately for the vast majority of people, there simply is no recovery. O hoshi an ggéir céim seo a bhí trí cheann in the budget is mí chaithimí a choirú go leor teaghlaí agus níos mó eile chun bachtanis. Inis agus Fine Gael agus Páirtín Loch Dibre i gcuirt, ní hinnan post a bhí agad agus grima choineal faoin gheal. 1 in 7 working people, Taoiseach, are living at the risk of poverty. 1 in 4 people in a jobless household. And there are families that you expect, these same families that you expect to pay water charges. The question I ask you to ask yourself, where is the recovery, Taoiseach, for the family out there that only has €8.75 at the end of the week after essential bills are paid, as we've seen in the recent MAB survey? Where is the recovery for the family that's sleeping in a hotel room or on their parents' couch because the rent supplement trap drove them out of their home? Where is the recovery for the family whose children will emigrate today, tomorrow and the day after? Where is the recovery for the 324 families whose loved ones lie on a hospital trolley today? Where is the recovery for the non-verbal child waiting for speech and language therapy tomorrow, today and all of next year? Minister, I, like everybody, desperately want to see recovery. But a recovery is more than GDP statistics, and that's what you're missing. It's more than marginal reductions in the live register or a deficit. If it's to mean anything at all, a real recovery must mean improving people's lives, that the financial and emotional burden of the recession is lifted, and that tomorrow is better than today. Of course, for some there is a recovery, but the vast majority of families are being left behind. Fine Gael and Labour's policy and its recovery is a recovery for the few and not the many. When the detail of what you've announced today sinks in, there's no doubt about it that hundreds of thousands of people across the state will be bitterly disappointed. 2015 for them will not be the end of austerity for hard-pressed struggling families who have to pay property taxes and new water charges. Today's budget does little or nothing for these families, and indeed some cases leaves them worse off. And we must never forget why all of this is the case. This year, servicing the state's debt burden will cost the taxpayer just under €8 billion. And the question I pose is how much of this is a cost of the failure of this government to deliver on the promise of the banking debt. What is the cost of your government's failure to securing banking debt and sovereign debt, as was promised in June 2012 at the European Council meeting? Taoiseach, the biggest single challenge facing the economy is the lack of private and public sector investment. That is why so many people continue to be unemployed or underemployed. That is why so many people continue to emigrate. And Taoiseach, remember 2011, your famous 5-point plan? You promised to invest €5 billion over the lifetime of the government to get people back to work. The Labour Party promised a billion from the Strategic Investment Fund. But budget after budget, you have failed to live up to these promises. And that is why the rate of job creation is so painfully slow, because you are failing to invest in the economy. And Sinn Féin has consistently and continually argued for real state-led stimulus. Time after time we have produced costed job creation proposals. First you dismissed our plans, now you have embraced some of them, but without the ambition and without the speed that the employment crisis demands. One of the most important choices that your government faced in advance of today's budget was whether to tax the wealthy or lift the burden from low and middle income earners. You are presenting your changes on the marginal rate of tax, the threshold at which people enter the marginal rate, and the changes to the USC as helping struggling families. The truth is rather different. Taken together, these combined changes, when taken alongside the impact of the property tax and water charges, will see those earning the average industrial wage in a worse-off situation. They will be neutral for middle-income families, but once again, the higher income earners will benefit significantly. Taoiseach, a low-paid worker on €30,000 will gain €174, less than the lowest possible water charge bill of €176. A middle-income earner on €50,000 will gain €546, all of which will be wiped out by water charges and the full cost of property tax, while a high-income earner on €70,000 will gain €746, the only category of worker in those at higher levels that will gain any real benefit from your tax changes. So where is the help for the low and middle-income families in these changes, Taoiseach? And I just wonder, when you were sitting around the Cabinet table earlier this morning, did you not blush when the Minister for Finance told you that you would be €657 better off, Taoiseach? Now, you earn €183,000 per year, and he was telling you that he's going to give you a tax cut of $657. Did you not blush when he actually informed you that somebody, a married couple working on €35,000, would get a quarter of the tax cut that you were going to get? This is the type of fairness that we've seen from this government for the last 4 years. Agus níl intas go jockey party ar nós Fine Gael ar Kenny Cosla Shaw, a shifsha and party privilege Shasta. And they were intas at a Lordini, Nargahog Takier, who were and realtas Takier party and locked up at Fanya Shaw. Each Bomuche, Ni through her, Ain Postna, La Loeduhan, Ain Fingate, or the Retta Emilha Penne. Ni Hodjahaisha, La Tromla Nadini at a Fui Penance Morial and the policy Jania at a Tokish Dahagan Realta Shaw. Taoiseach, at a time when children are being forced to sleep in cars, in tents, in hotel beds, on family floors because of the lack of investment in social housing, it is criminal for government to cut the top rate of tax. And Peter McVerry was right. He was right when he expressed outrage at the proposal, saying that he was dismayed and outraged. That is what Fine Gael and Labour are doing here today. Sinn Féin welcomes the closure of loopholes that allow multinational companies to reduce their tax liability. When we called for an ending of the double Irish, the Minister for Finance said that the only problem was the loophole that had the word Irish in it. He said that it was an American construction. He said there was nothing in the tax code that had allowed the Irish state to close it down. He said that in response to me. He misled the doll. No ifs, no buts about it, because today he has said he is closing down the double Irish, and we welcome that belatedly. Minister, the real tragedy in today's budget is the failure to abolish property tax and water charges. Fine Gael and Labour continue to overtax ordinary families. A fairer budget would shift the burden onto revenue sources less harmful to the domestic economy, while ensuring finance for investment in frontline services. Abolishing the property tax, a deeply unfair charge, would act as a massive stimulus to low and middle-income families. What would it mean for people out there? For the 1.8 million homeowners, it would mean €278 on average, right back into their pocket. Scrapping the introduction of water charges would have even a greater effect on the average family bill, which will be well in excess of the average touted by this government. And this government's proposal to provide working people with a €100 tax credit to offset the cost of water charges is no way meets the demands that are out there to compensate for the impact of hard-pressed families. And worse still, and it's been mentioned earlier, up to 880,000 working people do not have a tax liability, so they will be in no position to avail of this tax credit, even when it's available to the higher income earners. And the reason they don't have a tax liability is because they earn so little. These are the very people who will be worst affected by this charge. Sinn Féin, let's be clear, has committed to the total abolition of these unjust charges. And the reason we have done is because they are hurting families and they're hurting the domestic economy. And that is why we have said, if elected to government, we will scrap them. One of the most damaging consequences of successive Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Labour austerity budgets has been the dismantling of our public health system. I'm glad that Minister James Riley has attended. Maybe he's found the $500 million hole that was in the health budget last year. Because the health system needs not only the $500 million hole that was tried to take from the health budget last year, It needs not only that, but to meet demographic demands in health, it would need an additional €300 million to deal with a growing and ageing population. That hasn't been provided. What you've said is, let's stand still. Keep the budget the way it is. Don't deal with demographic demands, and that is particularly to be seen in the budget document, where you only provide 1% increase for the HSE regions in the West and other regions, which means there will be real cuts. Last year, Sinn Féin warned about cutting the $666 million from the health budget. We said that it would harm patients. We said it couldn't be found. But Fine Gael and Labour carried on regardless. What did you do? You withdrew thousands of medical cards from the most vulnerable in society. People with life-limiting conditions, you had the medical cards torn from them. Today's budget doesn't mark an end of austerity in health. Indeed, what we're going to see is more of the same over the next year. Our hospital and our health services will once again be forced to do more with less. The consequences will be felt in inpatient care and well-being all over the state. Today's total voted expenditure for health is 13.1. In plain English, Taoiseach, today's budget allocation means further reduction in health spending when increased demand is taken into account. And what will the consequences be? Because we're dealing on budget day with high-level figures, the same way we did last year. But what will the consequences, the real effects of this be? The real effects of the failure of your government to invest in health? It will be a two-tier health system that continues to stumble along. It will be public patients continuing to wait far longer for crucial diagnosis and procedures than those able to afford private health insurance. Waiting lists and trolley waits will continue. Agus ara ní wein go mé daoine folann, I bet you they full west Tosker, Hipper and Realta Shaw, Gearham the services Slancha a Hishkin. The mismanagement of housing policy by government played a central part in our economic collapse in 2007. Almost 4 years since Fine Gael and Labour took office, and the housing crisis continues. The private rental market is in crisis. Rent supplement caps introduced by the Taoiseach have forced hundreds of families into homelessness. Local authorities are being forced to house these families in hotels at huge cost to the state and to the families involved. And I would ask you, Taoiseach, I would ask you just for a second to imagine what it must be like to be forced out of your home because you can no longer afford the rise in market rents and because Joan Burton capped the rent supplement payments while refusing to introduce rent caps. Have you any idea of what it must feel like moving night after night with your children from emergency accommodation to a hotel room? You have to be up and out by 11 a.m. in the morning, nowhere to keep your possessions, unable to prepare breakfast for your family. And Minister, this isn't just theory. This isn't just fiction. This is the reality. It's the reality right here in this city for hundreds of homeless families who find themselves in this situation. Why? Because Fianna Fáil, before you, Fine Gael and Labour, all of you have slashed the capital spend on social housing. Since taking office, your government has cut $270 million from the housing budget, reducing the spend on social housing by almost 50% in 3 years. I want to welcome the government's commitment to invest in social housing. Any increase in the capital budget for social housing is to be welcome. But let's get real. What the government have talked about today is €400 million in total for 2015. It's an increase of €180 million. It's simply not good enough. It's not big enough. It's not bold enough. It's not ambitious enough. And it's simply a government that is out of touch and doesn't hear the major crisis that there is in relation to housing crisis in this city and right across the state. But we hear the government are slowly waking up to the problem, but you clearly don't grasp the full scale of the crisis. What is needed, Taoiseach, and what Sinn Féin have shown, is an immediate investment from the state of €1 billion, not the 180 additional €1 billion to start to get to grips with the social housing and homelessness crisis that we have in the state. That is the kind of urgent response that the housing and homeless crisis need. Once again, it is a case of too little, too late from Fine Gael and Labour. The increase in the homeless budget is also to be welcomed, though it is questionable whether it will even cover the recent increase in demand for emergency accommodation, let alone contribute to the ending of long-term homelessness. Taoiseach, today your government has announced a number of measures which you say are aimed at helping people with the cost of water charges. No doubt you will try to pitch this off as a generous measure born out of concern for the vulnerable, but let's look at it more closely. You introduced water charges. The initial average annual bill is expected to be €278. Since taking office, your government has reduced the household benefits package by €367. When you add the cuts to the household benefit package to the cost of water charges, pensioners and people with disability are already hundreds of euros worse off. The idea that €100 in any way compensates for what you have done to these people is an insult, Minister. The extension of the €100 to recipients on fuel allowance, an allowance itself that was cut by €120, still leaves almost 200,000 people on the live register with zero support towards their cost of water. And as winter approaches, older people, in particular living with the reality of fuel poverty, will not only be forced to go to bed early to save on heating bills, but they will now be worried about the cost of a cup of tea or a warm bath. Taoiseach, any increase in child benefit is to be welcome. But as to the €5 rise in the child benefit, the government, let's put this in context, the government has cut child benefit, your government, by €47 for the fourth child and €10 for other children. You cut the annual back-to-school clothing and footwear allowance to poor families by €100. All the while, the cost of living and education has been rising, pushing more and more families into debt. You cut maternity benefit by €32 per week, and the lone parents' income disregard was cut from €146 to €90 as a consequence of which a working lone mother is now down €28. So against this backdrop, Taoiseach, struggling families will barely notice the €5 per month in child benefit announced by your government today. €5, Taoiseach, wouldn't even buy you a pack of nappies, let alone make up the hardship caused by all the cuts this government has already made to child income supports. And the so-called Christmas bonus amounts to a one-off payment. You didn't even have any to commit to it for the next year. A one-off payment of between €25 and €57.50. People, Taoiseach, are struggling all year round, not just at Christmas. Many are still in debt from last year's Christmas bill that need much more than this miserly festive pittance. Minister, as with housing and social welfare, your announcements on education will leave many people bitterly disappointed. While the additional teachers, resource teachers and SNAs are to be welcomed, they will simply meet the increase in demands for services. No change in any of our schools as a result of this year. It's just to deal with demographic demands. Worse than this, in 2015, and this is what you didn't announce, as you do every year, you are going to increase student fees by another €250. Kept that one quiet on the Dáil floor. And you're going to reduce capitation grant for every single school in the state by a further 1%. Minister, this government was told that any further cuts in capitation grants would mean some schools would be no longer in a position to pay basic utility bills. Yet you plough ahead. Is it really the policy of Fine Gael and Labour to force the closure of schools as a result of this? Minister, last week I and my colleagues launched our alternative budget. It set out a fairer and more sustainable way of meeting the state's deficit targets. It sought to put $800 million directly back into the pockets of ordinary workers through the abolition of property taxes and scrapping the introduction of water charges. It outlined investment in disability services and supports. We prioritised investment in health and education. We sought to stem the tide of youth immigration. It was a budget that would help rebuild our economy, renew our society and repair our communities. Unfortunately, Taoiseach, your government has once again failed to listen. In addition to scrapping property tax and water charges, Sinn Féin committed to exempting 296,000 low-paid workers out of paying the USC. While the removal of 80,000 of those workers from the USC announced today is welcome, it simply doesn't go far enough. Cutting the lower rate of USC by 0.5% is simply no substitute for removing the remaining 210,000 of the lowest paid workers from the tax net. Taken together, these three measures would significantly reduce the risk of poverty among society's lowest income households, while at the same time stimulating domestic demand. In turn, we would have placed the burden of new tax measures on those most able to pay. We would have introduced a third rate of income tax at 48% on incomes above 100,000, raising €448 million. We would reintroduce the second home charge at €400, and we would have brought in additional tax measures such as increase in the betting tax. In total, Taoiseach, our costed measures bring an alternative budget. It raises an additional tax of €1.7 billion. But crucially, over €1 billion of that was going directly back into the pockets of ordinary working people. And this is what would have reversed growing inequality, what would have reversed poverty in our society. It would also have helped with the local economy by stimulating demand, and it would have saved jobs. In our alternative proposals for 2015, we focused on raising the living standards for the most vulnerable, increasing investment in disability services, reversing the crisis in frontline health care, and making education more vulnerable. No mention today of increase in FIS payments, as Sinn Féin suggested, of 10%, putting €1850 back into the pockets of those 47,000 families who rely on it. This is a measure that you could have introduced, but you decided not to. People with disabilities and one-parent families need a break, and that is why Sinn Féin in our alternative budget prioritised them. That's why we would have reversed the cut that you introduced for the respite grant, €320 that you took from those families, increasing the income disregard for one-parent families. These are all measures that the government could have introduced but decided not to introduce. Instead, what they wanted to do was reduce the tax burden on the most wealthy in society. And I'm sure, Taoiseach, you'll be delighted in conjuring up ways where you'll spend that extra €670 that you get your tax reduction. But I would contend, Taoiseach, you're not the hard-pressed out there. You're not the person going to St Vincent de Paul. You're not the person going to MABS. You're not one of the thousands of families that are struggling to keep a roof over your head or to make ends meet. The focus of this government should have been on the most vulnerable in society. It should have been about investing in public services. It should have been fixing the broken services that we have in health and education. At the end of 2010, public anger was at fever pitch. The incompetence and the corruption of the Fianna Fáil government made people realise the need for change. On the streets and in the polling booths, people voted for that change. Fine Gael and Labour promised a democratic revolution. They promised investment in jobs and services. They promised fairness. But what did we get? The same old economic incompetence and political cronyism that came before. And as each Fine Gael and Labour budget comes and goes, there is a growing sense that nothing has changed. That is why 100,000 people marched for the right to water in Dublin last Saturday. That is why support for Sinn Féin and other progressive candidates reached 60% in Dublin South West and Roscommon South Leitrim last Friday. That is why a government with an inbuilt majority couldn't even win a Shannon by-election. It seemed that after 6 years of harsh austerity, people's expectations have been lowered. We were just too accustomed to the harsh reality of crippling austerity, endless bank bailouts and the same old politics as usual. But something is changing. The more people hear of economic recovery, the more it jars with the reality of their own lives that aren't getting any better. The more the government spin the line that we have finally turned the corner, the more people are asking why they have less money in their pockets at the end of the week. There is a recovery taking place, the figures bear it out, but it is a recovery for the few, not for the many. It is a two-tier, two-speed recovery. Just as today's budget is a two-tier budget. Tax cuts that benefit the better off, while the rest are left to rot. Minister, Budget Day is about much more than balancing the books. The debate we're having today is about more than listing the tax and spend measures. This is a debate about the type of society we want to build, about the type of future we want to leave for our children. Sinn Féin believes in a better, fairer, more equal and prosperous Ireland is possible. But it can't be achieved. Not a chance it can be achieved on the basis of the policies that you have outlined today. Yes, the Troika will be happy with what you've announced, but Irish society will continue to privilege the few over the many. It will continue as a society for the elites, not for citizens. Poverty, homelessness, health and education inequalities, unemployment and immigration will still be the daily reality for tens of thousands of people. Minister, you, Taoiseach and your colleagues lack vision. A century on from the Easter Rising in 1916, when the women and men of this country dare to dream of a better future, the comparison with today's political class couldn't be starker. The disillusionment of W.B. Yeats with the lack of vision among his generation springs to mind, when he said, "What need you, being come to sense, but fumble in a greasy till and add the halfpence to the pence?" But Yeats also remembered a different generation. He remembered people who had courage to imagine a better society when he wrote, "Yet there are a different kind, the names that still your childish play. They have gone about the world like wind." Taoiseach, Ireland is crying out for a new generation who have the courage to lift their horizons above the greasy till, a generation who believe that a better Ireland is possible. Taoiseach, the winds of change are once again blowing, and the failure of your government to live up to the promises that you made in 2011 will be your undoing. The budget lacks ambition. It doesn't deal with the unemployment crisis, the housing crisis or the crisis in health. Once again, Taoiseach, you are giving tax breaks to the rich and giving nothing to low and middle income earners. Even the most modest measures outlined today protect the privileged and protect poverty in our society. For those reasons, I and my Sinn Féin colleagues will not be supporting this budget.